My name is Monica Byrne Jimenez. I am the Executive Director of UCEA and happy to welcome all of you to today's general session. It has been a difficult year. Uncertainty and anxiety have been common for all of us. One thing that has kept me going, has kept me grounded, is family. My family, of course, but the UCEA family as well. And while we miss seeing each other this year, I'm excited about our convention and what it has to offer. I'm also really proud of the work that the Convention Planning Committee and the headquarters staff and our production team has put together for us. They've worked so very hard to strengthen our family. Today, I'm coming from East Lansing, Michigan, and our new home at Michigan State University. In keeping with our values, I want to recognize the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fire Confederation of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi people. In doing so, I affirm their sovereignty, their history, and their experiences. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that many in our communities have experienced or are experiencing loss because of COVID-19. My heart goes out to you all, and I know that as a family, UCA's heart goes out to you as well, and we hold you close as you navigate these difficult times. After this session, I hope you will all explore the convention. Our platform is officially open, and you can go in and see all of our asynchronous sessions. The synchronous sessions kick off next Monday with our graduate student programming, and then the main convention starts on Tuesday. Please join us there as well. Our final general session is Thursday from 4 to 5:30 and explores system leadership in the wake of COVID. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Wright from San Diego State University and member of this year's planning committee. Thank you, James, from the bottom of my heart for all the hard work you have done as part of your team to get our virtual convention up and running.
Thank you so much, Monica. And on behalf of UCEA 2020 and this year's president, Dr. Bill Black, and the planning committee, and all of the hard work and the dedicated folks at UCEA headquarters, it really is an honor to introduce our general session number 2. And the topic of this general session is called Coloniality's Enduring Legacy and Leadership Preparation and Impact on Responding to Crisis, a Global Perspective. So when we talk about coloniality, just the idea of coloniality in this context, it's a process of naming and identifying historically privileged Eurocentric epistemologies, research methodologies, intellectual norms that shape the field of educational leadership and administration. But aside from just naming these historically deleterious processes that are impacting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and their children. So with that in mind, we are looking forward to an insightful conversation amongst friends and allies and just a discussion around the ways in which coloniality shows up in different parts of the globe. Each of you are in different parts of the world. And it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this general session, Dr. Darlene Opfer. Dr. Opfer is former vice president and director of RAND Education and Labor, and holds the distinguished chair in education policy at the RAND Corporation. She served as director of RAND Education from 2011 to 2018. From 2005 to 2011, she was the director of research and senior lecturer in research methods in school improvement at the University of Cambridge in England. And University of Cambridge's Faculty of Education. Dr. Opfer has conducted policy research studies for a number of local, state, and national governments on issues that affect teachers in schools, including recruitment and retention, professional development, and impact of policies on teacher practice. In 2014, Dr. Opfer was selected as Thomas J. Alexander Fellow by the OECD, where she used TALIS 2013 data to explore conditions that support teacher professional development. Dr. Offer's research includes national studies of teacher professional development in places such as England, Turkey, and other places across the United States. Dr. Offer also serves as an advisor to the National Council for Educational Research and Training in India. She served as a consultant for the United States Agency for International Development, working on the increased access to quality education and training initiatives in South Africa. Dr. Offer has authored numerous books, reports, journal articles, and has presented to practitioners, researchers, and policymakers across the globe. Dr. Offer holds a PhD in education policy studies from the University of Virginia and a BA in education from Stetson University. So without further ado, Dr. Offer.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Yes. So Dr. Opfer has not been able to log on as of yet. So can you introduce the rest, James, or would you like me to take over? I'm happy to do it.
Yes.
All right. Let me get to that. My apologies, everyone. All right. So yes, so next I'd like to introduce Dr. Mohamed Almeski. Dr. Elmeski is a clinical associate professor at Arizona State University. He is the co-chair of the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement, which was held in Marrakesh in January of this year. His professional expertise includes the design and implementation of educational reform, operational management, change leadership, monitoring and evaluation, and capacity development. His research interests include community involvement, educational leadership, teacher preparation, social emotional learning, and school transformation in marginalized neighborhoods. Dr. Elmeski earned his PhD in Comparative International Development, Education, and Program Evaluation from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He has led a diverse career that includes teaching, research, technical assistance, and project management in the USA, Africa, Central America, MENA, and South Asia. Welcome, Dr. Elmeski. Dr. Rodolfo Rincones is Associate Professor in the Department of Ed Leadership and Foundations at the University of Texas, El Paso. His administrative duties have included directing Principal Preparation Program, the doctoral program in Ed Leadership and Administration, and chairing the department from 2009 to 2012. His professional expertise spans over 30 years in both K-12 and higher education systems. In K-12 educational systems, he planned, conducted, and administered research projects and program evaluations. At this level, he also worked with educational policy, educational reform, and accountability. His experience in higher ed is also extensive in both the U.S. and Mexico. For over 2 years, he collaborated at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Ciudad Juárez, Mexico, at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana and the Universidad Nacional Autónoma, both in Mexico City. Currently, he collaborates with researchers at the University Autónoma of Mexico and other Mexican universities in the study of racism in elementary schools in Mexico. Thank you, Dr. Rincones. Dr. Ann Lopez is a professor of educational leadership and policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, and a scholar with public education experience as a former secondary school teacher and administrator in a large school board in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Lopez is the director of the Center of Leadership and Diversity and Provostio advisor on access programs at the University of Toronto. She serves on a number of international boards, including the National Association for Multicultural Education, the World Council for Equity and Diversity in Education, and International Board of European Institute of Education for Democratic Culture. She is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of School Leadership and co-series editor of Studies in Educational Administration. Her scholarship focuses on anti-racist education, culturally responsive leadership, Decolonizing Educational Leadership, Equity and Diversity, and School Leadership. Her recent books include Decolonizing Educational Leadership, Exploring Alternative Approaches to Leading School and Culturally Responsive and Socially Just Leadership, From Theory to Action. She is the 2015 recipient of the NAME Multicultural Educator of the Year and the 2020 recipient of the Award of Distinguished Contributions to Teaching at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Born and raised in Jamaica, Anne draws inspiration in her fight from justice and equity from her grandmother, who she describes as her guiding light. Welcome, Anne. Azad Oommen is the co-founder of Global Schools Leader, a nonprofit that develops effective school leadership to improve learning of students from marginalized communities and the world. He was the founding executive director of the Central Square Foundation, an India-based venture philanthropy fund that invests in systemic reforms to improve the quality of student learning. He has worked extensively to promote young leaders, having run leadership development programs for the America India Foundation in India, City Year in South Africa, and the Congressional Hunger Center in the US. He serves on the boards of the Central Square Foundation and the India School Leadership Institute. Azad has a master's degree in public affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton and a bachelor's degree in international economics from Georgetown University. Thank you, Azad, for being here. Ian Potter is the chief executive of the Gosport and Fareham Multi-Academy Trust. The GFM is the first local multi-academy trust in Hampshire, United Kingdom. Prior to its formation in 2017, he was the head teacher of Bay House School, during which time all 5 Ofsted inspections judged the leadership to be outstanding. Ian's research interests include system leadership. He coordinates the International School Leadership Development Network, researching social justice leadership in schools internationally. He is vice chair of the Belmas Council and the Society's coordinator for international affairs and their representative on the CCEA and board. He is a member of the British Educational Research Association Conference Committee and the ASCL local representative for Hampshire and a fellow of the Chartered College of Teaching. This is truly an outstanding panel, and I'm really proud to call all of you friends and colleagues in this journey to improve education and educational leadership worldwide. So thank you so much for taking this leap with us today and joining our session. Dr. Opfer, it is good to see you. You can just get the conversation going.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be with this distinguished panel this morning and talking about decolonization of leadership preparation. So I think I want to start the session by going around to each of you and asking if you could tell us a little more about the scope of your work and what parts of the world that you focus on. So why don't we start with Azad? If you could tell us a little bit about what you do.
Thank you, Darlene, and appreciate Monica for the invitation to join you all here. For the first time, I felt that I should have done a PhD because it's intimidating to be in a room with such esteemed speakers. So, in 2016 we started Global School Leaders as in response to some work that we had done in India, where we had started the India School Leadership Institute in 2013. And if one looks back at India in 2009, India had passed the Right to Education Act, which very rapidly expanded access to education. But there was a huge challenge around the quality of education being delivered, which resulted in huge dropouts in the school system. About 50% of kids were dropping out by 5th grade. And one of the things that we found was that school leadership was a really critical missing component at the time. The government was beginning to set up a national center for school leadership, but it hadn't been done yet. So we created the India School Leadership Institute as a nonprofit that was working on school leadership in India. And in 2016, we started to respond to what we were seeing as a growing international need in low and middle income countries around the world around school leadership. So there were very few, the research literature that we were looking at, a lot of the programs that we were looking at were all based in the global north. And we were just finding a real lack of programs in the global south that were responding to this need to invest in school leaders. So today we work in 4 countries in a deep way. So we work in India, Malaysia, Kenya, and Indonesia. And we have, during the COVID time, we've also created partnerships in Uganda, Nigeria, and the Philippines. And a lot of our work is around what I like to say is getting the school leader out of their office and into the classroom to begin to view themselves as a support for teachers and not just as an administrative leader in the school, which is typically what the expectation that's being imposed upon them by these systems. In light of today's conversation, I just wanted to point out that all of the countries that we work in are former colonies. So this topic is very relevant to what we're doing, and our work is very practical in terms of looking at ways to empower school leaders within systems that don't really empower school leaders to get the school leaders to be able to deliver quality education in their schools. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. Anne, I'm going to turn to you now to tell us about your work.
Okay, thank you so very much, everyone. It's just great to be in this space. And I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada. It's also important for me to note that I'm coming to you from the region of Peel, which is part of the Treaty Lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so it's important that we acknowledge the territory of the Ashnabek, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, and the land that's home of the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. So it's very important where I'm coming from, and more widely speaking, Turtle Island. So it's just amazing to be here. So just a little bit about the work that I do. I started as a classroom teacher and as a school administrator. And one of the aspects that came out of that for me was how much resides in the area of leadership that really impacts so much of how students experience schooling that we really have not unpacked, or where practices and knowledge continue to be grounded in coloniality. So that is really in terms of the work I do. I focus on my research, working with school leaders, one in terms of, and particularly Black school leaders, South Asian school leaders, not so much Indigenous school leaders, but a larger community and context of what we would say are BIPOC school leaders. And so really to examine what can we learn from their journey, what can we learn from their practices that can in fact impact the work of school leaders. It was so, in listening to our first speaker, I conduct research in Kenya, Jamaica, as well as and what has emerged from that work is really how much of whose knowledge is valued, how is leadership thought of, and the practices that happen in these spaces continue to foreground and continue to hinge on colonial ways of thinking. And so I'm really now looking at decolonizing education. And later on, I'll talk about my own journey, having born and raised in Jamaica and experienced colonial schooling. What does that mean in terms of doing the work and how you position yourself in that work? And last thing I just want to say, and to my colleague that just spoke around the whole notion of knowledge within ed leadership really being generated by scholars mainly from the global north and the west. And as a professor of ed leadership, that is what led me to do research in areas like Kenya and Jamaica, because that knowledge is almost non-existent. And so that is something that as folks who do ed leadership and school leadership specifically need to think about, how we can do that work, how do we include those voices, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation for the rest of the day.
Great, thank you, Anne. Mohammed, let's turn to you now to tell us about your work.
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you, everyone. Do
Over to
you hear me clearly?
Mhm.
Yes, over to you
Good.
now, Monica?
There is a bit of static, and I don't know why it's because of me or just I hear a bit of background, but that's fine. So my full name is Mohamed Almeski, and I have the pleasure of at least knowing three of the colleagues here and met in Qatar, met in many places, and I think, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of other opportunities to connect. And thank you so much, Monica, for inviting me to the panel. Where do I begin? I begin from where I am right now. So now I'm based in Morocco, representing Arizona State University as the director of a teacher development project focused on pre-service teacher preparation. And this is the USAID funded cooperative agreement over 5 years. And so I've got more of a split position as a clinical associate professor with Arizona State University, but a significant chunk of my time is really overseeing the work on both the operational leadership side, but at the same time the technical side. So this is what I do now, but it's just maybe a little bit of what I've been doing in the last 5 years, because prior to working or joining Arizona State University, I was a senior researcher with the American Institutes for Research based in Washington, D.C., where again it was the combination of two types of hats, the evaluator hat and also the technical assistance hat, where I worked in Ethiopia, in Haiti, mainly. That was more of a 50% of my time. So this was an amazing opportunity really to deepen knowledge, not just about the implementation in the field and what the field looks like and what the actual context of implementation is like, but at the same time, really like this leap of evidence to practice. It's highly complex, and I'm not saying anything that you don't know, but certainly I think being a researcher who is also transitioning many times into doing technical assistance, especially focused on systems change, it's a very humbling opportunity. In terms of the leaders that I'm working with right now, they are not necessarily school principals, but these are system leaders at the level of the ministry, and at the same time system leaders at the level of the teacher training institutes, be it at the university level or be it at teacher training institutes that are affiliated with the Ministry of Education. So this is it in a nutshell, about a little bit about me.
Thank you. Ian, and over to you.
Well, hello, everybody. Really pleased to be part of this panel, and thank you ever so much for the invitation. I'm presently it's probably in the English context, the equivalent of a superintendent, having been moving from principalship to that role. And interestingly, in terms of the school at which I was principal, and now working across a number of schools locally, some people consider whether the multi-academy trust concept in England is a sense of the sponsor school in itself colonializing other schools in the geographic area. So that might be something that we return to thinking about with regard to school improvement and principalship development. My research interest is around social justice leadership, and I'm very pleased to be able to announce the 10th year anniversary of the ISLDN, the International School Leadership Development Network, which was a network sponsored by UCA and Belmath over the last 10 years. And just a quick plug to say that we're about to have a book published shortly, which captures our 10 years and followed up by a special issue research journal, which hopefully will be paving the way for the next 10 years of that group of international researchers looking into social justice leadership in high needs contexts or other contexts across the world. And we have nearly 32 countries that are contributing data and evidence to our empirical inquiry, and therefore our findings and our analysis and our thinking. And so that's a significant piece of work that, and I'm very privileged to be working with researchers across the globe who are tackling this issue of what does social justice leadership look like in many cases within the context of colonial situations. And so looking at the way in which those who have been dominated by others, how they are emancipated is part of that social justice agenda. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation that we're about to engage with.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to turn to another question. And Ian, I'll start with you and we'll go sort of in reverse order. This year has been incredibly challenging, to say the least, and has really strained, every educational system around the world. What have you learned about leading schools in the wake of COVID-19, and what's been your priorities during this period?
Well, thanks for the question. From a practitioner perspective and leading schools, I would say it has been that social justice agenda. And what's been very significant in the leadership challenges that I've had over the last 6 months, 8 months within the English context has been how the inequities within our community have absolutely come to the fore as a consequence of the impact of the pandemic. And so that's been a really salutary lesson for myself as a school leader, because in many ways, I'd like to think that due to my research interests and my particular interests, that I was a leader that understood how one tried to achieve greater equity amongst those that you serve. But when something like the pandemic has hit, you realize that what you thought you were achieving and that greater sense of equity, actually, you hadn't been doing as good a job as you felt, because the pandemic brought the stark differences absolutely to light. So what that's led me to have to deeply reflect on is how, in many ways, I've taken for granted and been a degree myopic about the interventions that I thought I'd been taking to, if you like, bring about greater equity, so that when the pandemic came, they hadn't been as impactful as I thought they'd been. And so actually, it's been, as I said, a bit of a wake-up call to realize that those inequities below the surface that you perhaps don't see, those things that you've been a little blind to because you think you're doing a great job in emancipating people, empowering people, and actually it wasn't done to that great extent. And I think that that's often the case with regard to the topic that we're discussing today, is as you are trying to decolonize things, it's really hard to not know what you can't see, or to know what you don't know. And so I think the question is a really sound one in the context of how am I recognizing in the lack of social justice that I thought I'd led on, how are you actually decolonizing when you think you are? And are you doing it to any great depth or extent?
Great. Thank you. Mohammed, how about for you? Oh, you're on mute. Okay, well, while
So I'll be.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
Hello.
good.
Yes. So as I said, I'll be talking from a systems level rather than a specific school scale. For me, the thing that came out from this experience of COVID, really, and I think it helps even with the activity that we're implementing right now, are two things. First of all, this has been an amazing opportunity really to expedite the I would call it the digital expansion in terms of training, in terms of communication, in terms of even creating a culture of I would say of virtual communities. prior to COVID, if you wanted to travel from if you wanted to have a meeting, you're really going to spend 6 hours on the road, moving from one place to another, drinking coffee or tea, whatever, and having a presentation. But to have one presentation, you waste something like 2 days of travel. Right now, I think, and because of COVID, it forced a bit of a cultural transformation at the level of the entire country, where virtual interaction, virtual mentoring, virtual support, virtual communities are not strange or alien. People are becoming more used to them, and they're becoming more efficient. One other thing that came up also in my interaction, especially with system leaders, but at the same time with school principals, some school principals I had interviews with, is that those who made a difference, really, especially given the fact that Morocco, as you know, is on the low middle income category, and the digital divide is at times scary. Rural areas do not have much of an exposure really to the digital courses and solutions provided by the ministry, regardless of the fact that the ministry really has been generous in making sure that everyone who can access the platform at the ministry level can access it without any charges in terms of data. They can access the platform. But really, I think those who manage to provide local solutions were the school principals, and at the same time, those superintendents at the regional level who worked at a more distributed level, who did not wait for the center to communicate the solutions to them, but really had direct, honest conversations with the community, and they knew that they don't want a lost, I'm not going to call it a lost generation, but a lost year, or maybe almost 2 years in terms of schooling. Those directors, school principals made a difference, especially in this specific year. Others didn't. And again, and it's always going to be blamed on the fact that the yes, communities, families cannot access some of the solutions, especially in terms of digital solutions. But you could see regions where you got the same socioeconomic level of communities where some schools made a difference since other schools didn't.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And
Thank
about
you.
you?
So, right, I'm going to maybe take a little bit different approach or some of the conversations. So, one, I think COVID reminds us of the failings of equity and diversity discourses as really performative work. And I think that that has to be a critical conversation around that. And in many ways in which equity and diversity discourses avoided talking about white supremacy. It wasn't until the mass social movements that people felt that it was okay to begin to expose systems built on coloniality and white supremacy. So people are a little bit surprised that COVID laid bare the inequities. We knew all along those structural inequities were there. We refused to see them. So COVID also forced a lot of people to look at their own positionality. How are they engaging in education and educational leadership? It forces us, particularly in the global South, as we examine neoliberalism and neoliberal education policies. Do we really need the global north to emancipate the global south? Do we need, or do we empower folks in the global south to emancipate themselves? What COVID has brought to bear is so how much work we've got to do around decentering whiteness, around decentering coloniality in the conversations, and around decentering white supremacy, the language, the practices, the thinking that undergirds all of this. What exactly are we doing in ed leadership courses? So I think for me, that was what COVID did. And it was really very interesting. The other thing that I think COVID quickly brought to bear, and I think some of us talked about that, is the resiliency of school leaders on the ground, and I can speak here in Toronto, how school leaders had to juggle so many balls, unknowing they had to deal with so many uncertainties around resources. Am I going to get COVID? Just landscape, and really this idea. So we have language matters, and hopefully today we begin to deconstruct some of this. Exactly what do we mean by normal? What is it we want to go back to? What are people fighting to go back to? Are we going to recreate white supremacy structures for kids to go in schools, or are we going to use this moment to change where we go? So that is something that came out of COVID-19. And so there was this tension that many school leaders expressed around really sort of the details of the job, and then how, and particularly critical school leaders, how do they then keep, we can label it what we want, social justice, equity, decolonize. Let's forget the labels for a bit, and let's just say where in that work they find space within all of that tension and upheaval. How do you keep focus, therefore, on critical work? It's really some interesting questions. So maybe one of the things as ed lead folks who do ed leadership is to begin to think about how do we support school leaders on that journey, which is some of what I've been hearing for COVID, because you can be so busy worrying around about masks and safety and not enough attention as to how maybe certain groups continue to be marginalized within the system. So it's an interesting time. I think we're still living through it. It's still unfolding, and we're going to be reading a lot about it and research around some of these things. So I was surprised when people said, "Oh, COVID laid bare inequities in society." I hate to tell folks it was always there. People just chose not to see it.
Yeah, good points. Azad, how about you? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, you missed that great introduction. I was just kidding. No, I was just saying that it's been really interesting to hear what people have been saying because it resonates so much with from very different perspectives with what we've been experiencing on the ground. When COVID hit, we felt what we were seeing with the schools that were in our programs were that all of a sudden schools were just told to shut down, and there was no guidance really given beyond saying, okay, your schools are shut. And so we knew that we could be a resource to school leaders who, by and large, have not really been trained for their position to really provide some practical guidance on what could be done during this time. In order to guide our efforts, we actually did a survey of, it turned out to be about 1,800 school leaders from across the global south. And there were two things that emerged really strongly from that. One was that school leaders were really concerned about the well-being of their students, but didn't really know what to do about that. And the second was that they were really struggling with this idea of like, how do we engage our kids in remote learning? Because immediately, the whole world turned towards, okay, let's use that tech and let's do distance learning and all this. And it was fine if you've been exposed to that in the past, but most of the schools that we work with had not really embraced ed tech in a meaningful way before that. So a lot of our work was first was around how do you get school leaders to think about the well-being of their students. This is not something that school leaders that we work with typically think about, right? I mean, their job is to run a school, and that's what they do. And being conscious of the well-being of their kids is not something that they had experience with. So to the point where we were creating guides around this is how you talk to your kids about emotional trauma, and this is how you train your teachers to do this and similar things. And the second thing then was around this whole emerging area around how do you use technology. And there again, what Mohammed was saying earlier about school leaders who were agile and were able to respond to conditions on the ground quickly, having a big impact. Because initially in countries like India and Kenya, what we were finding was that only around 50% of kids had access to some sort of a electronic device through which they, well, a computer essentially, or a tablet through, or a phone through which they could access online learning. So how do you do you only focus on the 50%? Do you look at all of the kids? How do you get more and more? So, some of the school leaders started to reach out to parents to say, can you get your neighbor's phone? And they cobble together solutions essentially. So that was the second bit. But then, also the teachers are not taught in a remote fashion. And I remember the first talk that I gave virtually, I was so nervous and I didn't know. Like, it's so weird to talk to a screen and you don't have no feedback. And, I think teachers have faced a very similar journey in terms of getting used to how to teach in a remote sense. But I think so, and then the third thing that I think just as a broad generalization that's emerged is this whole engagement with community. That you think that schools being a dominant institution in each community would have strong community relations. But what we found was that by and large, principals hadn't, school leaders hadn't really engaged with their community. And now suddenly they had to engage with the community, right? Like if kids needed food, they had to figure out who was providing food in the community. If kids needed healthcare, they had to figure all that out. And all these things that, like and I'm not using the word normal, but if you are a well-trained school leader, you would think like, okay, this is the range of my responsibilities, and this is all that I need to look out for. And in this case, in the schools in which we work, where the school leaders hadn't been trained, there was this real need for practical guidance for them to engage with the community, to get their teachers prepared, and to look after the well-being of their kids. So let me stop there.
Yeah, what I would say, given the work that we've been doing here in the U.S. on COVID, is that even in places that have leadership preparation, the leaders were completely lost in this.
If I may, I'm not sure if you can see me or hear me.
Yeah, we can.
But I was skipped on the first round. I didn't.
Sorry about
that. And so I'm going to try to put together that first introduction and the response to the second question. And I'm coming to you from the border region of Mexico and the United States, that is perhaps the largest binational community in the world. Perhaps 2.5 million people live in this region. And here we see two different realities. On the one hand, for example, in the U.S., some people might say that this is where the country ends, or some, like we like to say, this is where the country begins. And Mexicans say the same thing. The northern border is where Mexico ends, but the Mexican people on the north said that's where the country begins. So I say this just to give you a picture of the different realities that we're immersed in, where in El Paso, 85% of the population is Latinx, Mexican American descent, some Native Americans. And so in preparing leaders for a context like this, that I call a border context, because it is always living on the border. It is not it's full of challenges. And when COVID hit, and this is Texas, by the way. It is not New Mexico, it's not Mexico, it's still Texas. And that has connotations because we are in a conservative state, heavy on accountability. And we think that when COVID hit, it was I think a similar approach to Anne's response. We thought, well, this is a perfect time to think and reflect, to stop what we're doing in schools. And we sort of took a reflection on Ivan Illich's This School in Society, and we said, well, this is a good opportunity that this terrible disease is giving us to think about what we should do in schools. We know there is the technological, the digital responses, but here in this context, don't mean a whole lot sometimes, because almost a third of the population live on the poverty levels, and having a computer sometimes is not possible. Although schools are trying to provide solutions to that problem. But sometimes, nobody's supervising kids at home because parents have to work 2 or 3 times a job jobs during the day. And so on the Mexican side, with a more centralized government dictating everything from Mexico City to the rest of the country, and the digital responses are not there. It has been a more challenging and difficult situation. We don't know the numbers for sure, but there's all sorts of problems, kids dropping out, not showing up. They have gone to the commercial television to provide educational solutions to the kids because the digital solutions are not there. But there's nobody supervising kids. There is, levels of poverty that parents have to get out of work and not supervising kids. So although we live in the first world, the situations here are very much like the colonial, world in which a lot of you are referring to. So that's sort of trying to put together two of the questions that you asked earlier.
Yes. And I'm sorry I skipped you. I missed the introductions and I thought you weren't joining us. So I want to get to the main topic for this panel, which is decolonization of leadership and leadership preparation. And so I will go back to you, Ernesto, and ask, how do you think about that in your work around leadership and leadership preparation? So anybody want to take that?
Darlene, I think, Darlene, I think Rodolfo is, I think you got the names.
Names mixed, sorry.
You got the former speaker, but so Rodolfo, do you want to continue with the question?
Yes, please.
Sure. I probably can think of 2 or 3 things that we can think in decolonizing leadership preparation. Perhaps the first one is that we need to look at the construction of our field of leadership. A lot of people even wonder if there is a field or something to be studied under leadership. And so I think the first thing I constantly look and reflect upon is what are the hegemonic forces that constructed our field, what is called our field of leadership in educational leadership. And always try to think about, what is that we are immersed in, that we're studying, that we are, teaching about. Who is learning about these things, and for what reasons? Why are there, why do we have this kind of programs? And for whom are the results or the outcomes of what we are doing? Again, we live in a region, I live in a region that we need a lot of social justice leadership. And so how do we communicate that? How do we, it's a convincing conscientization and afraid sort of thing that a lot of leadership with social justice orientation is needed. But there's a lot of resistance from people who come through leadership programs. There is a hegemonic way of thinking about issues, and to deconstruct that is always a challenge. The second thing I briefly want to say is that, I'll go back to that, is that we are in a field where we're constantly, I think somebody already mentioned this, where we deal with practitioners, teachers who want to be principals, principals who want to be superintendents, and there's always an issue between practice and scholarship and evidence-based and theoretical-based preparation. And practice has been put down, belittled by scholarship, that we need to be able to capture how can we take practice, existing knowledge, and build upon that. I think that's another thing to decolonize the thinking that we have. Certainly, the way we always need to be reflecting on the way we reproduce hegemonic culture in terms of how do we reproduce dominant structures, epistemological models, racism, patriarchalism, and several other isms that that are there all the time. Um, we live. I live in a region that has been colonized first by Mexico, by the Spaniards, and then by the U.S. And so it's a double, it's an internal colonization process that we also need to deal with all the time. And very few people realize that we are dealing with the colonial way of thinking, and so we need to change that. It's not easy in our programs, but I mean that's a quest that we need to always be dealing with.
Yeah, thank you. And how about you? Your thinking on decolonization of leadership?
Oh, thanks for that. I think what my colleague just mentioned was so, but I want to bring some, maybe just share some things that I've been thinking about, and as I've sought to ground the work that I do within a decolonial framework. And so, number one, I think we have to look back a little bit as to the knowledge that have always undergirded the field of ed leadership, who whose knowledge has always been considered to be the guiding force or guiding, I don't know, light in this field. Who do we give students to read? Whose work do they read? Who do they cite? What are we teaching in leadership preparation programs around that kind of knowledge? So I think in our field we really have to begin there, and really have to begin, I think, with this. What the colleague was speaking about, this whole idea of self-reflexivity, because you can't engage in decolonizing social justice work unless you decolonize your own mind. And what does that mean? It means, how do we disrupt neoliberal ways of thinking and doing that looks good on the surface, but really perpetuates all of the things that we've been talking about. And then when students come into ed leadership programs, they hear all about sort of the different things, check boxes that they must do. So I think that's an important piece, and that's one of the things that in my own work I seek to do. While we try to get research and bring voices in from the global south and so on. So that's one piece. I think the second piece of it as well is this whole notion of what we talk about as, I say, restoring capacity. And how do we create space for those who are aspiring to leadership, those who are already in the field, in schools, doing the work? How do we support them on their daily journey to find the agency to disrupt when they see things in their spaces? And I think this is the disconnect sometimes we talk about between practice and the theory. And when school leaders are willing to step outside of the norm, what are the supports there for them to do that? And so I think so it's a work on self. It's a work on what we think about and how we dislodge coloniality. I think it's a scholar from South America, QAnon, I can't remember his name now, who talks about coloniality of power and coloniality of knowledge, and how there really has not been dislodged from ed leadership discourse and or practice. So I think those are some of the things that maybe we can begin to think about. And one of the things I also do in the work, the decolonizing work that I do, is to acknowledge that there are both professional and personal risks for school leaders doing the kind of work. And again, how do we support? How do we take up? How do we create community? We haven't talked about that as yet, because we're speaking of the work as if it's an individual endeavor. Some level it is, but on another level, it has to be collaborative. It has to be grounded in community. So hopefully we can begin to see ed leadership articles and books and all of that really centers decolonizing education, decenters colonial hegemonic way of thinking, and also offer some practical suggestions onto how ed leaders and school leaders can do this work within their own context.
Great, thanks. Azad, do you want to take a stab at this too?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to echo everything that Dr. Lopez just said, because, so much of our work was driven by the desire to have the voice of the Global South present in these discussions around school leadership. And we focus primarily exclusively on school leadership. So not the larger field of education leadership as a whole. But, I think when I mean, what started out as sort of a reaction to saying, okay, where are the voices of the Institute Aminuddin Baki in Malaysia, or the NCSL in India, or the Institute for Education Planning and Administration in Ghana? Like, where are these voices? Where is the research? Like, like, how is that feeding into this global narrative around education leadership? And we were just not finding those voices, and so a lot of our work was really driven by saying, how can we create a platform for these voices to feed into that? And obviously with a practical thing of, okay, unless we actually get into these countries and work, then we won't be able to figure out what's really needed in these countries. But the interesting thing is, from my perspective, as I was thinking about this conversation, was when we first started out our work, everybody said, "Oh, there'll need to be so much contextualization for your work, right? Because Malaysia and Kenya couldn't be more different." And of course, it turns out that 3 out of the 4 countries in which we're working are British colonies, and the education systems look exactly alike. And this is like 50 to 70 years after the British have left, and the education systems look exactly alike. What's expected of principals looks exactly alike. The way principal supervisors work is exactly alike. And so they actually it meant that in the current system, there wasn't that much contextualization that needed to happen. And that was really, that then started us to think about what would school leadership look like if you defined it within the Kenyan context, right? If you actually began with, and even saying the Kenyan context means there's, different leadership contexts within Kenya, and which leadership context would you be referring to? There's so many sort of distinctions that one would need to make there. But what would happen if you took a Kenyan rooted approach to leadership? How do communities there traditionally think about leadership? How would you apply those principles to schools? Things like this. So these are all things that we started to think about now. And it feels like that's a big need for research in that area, so that we can actually start to see, and what would happen if you actually started implementing programs from that perspective, as opposed to what we see typically around the world, which is programs that come out of the US or the UK or Australia or Canada, that are then taken and then just sort of adapted for the countries they're looking to implement these in. But what would happen if you actually started with a homegrown approach to leadership and thinking about that? So that's just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, interesting. Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you next.
No, thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
My thoughts on this one are, how do I support school leadership and principleship evolution, and as well as preparation? Because obviously that a lot of my job, and I've got two approaches to that that resonates with what others have said. I think the first approach is criticality. And how are you supporting principleship in their criticality? And for me, it's the shift from the reflective practitioner mode to the reflexive practitioner mode. How are you reflecting on how you've learnt to reflect? And I think that sits with what's been said about dominant discourses, or the learned behaviours of the way in which we think, particularly within the context in which I work, within England and within Britain. And here am I wearing the poppy today because of the armistice tomorrow of the 11th of November with regard to the First World War. What criticality is being brought in the fact that many people in our schools and our youngsters are purchasing that poppy? Is it being brought to their attention that many of the people from the so-called empire fought in that war but were never recognized? So those of so many of those who died in the trenches alongside their white companions, they are not written, their names are not written up on war memorials across the country. Very significant. And so these become opportunities, and it's like the debate around historic figures in how they are presented. And the big debates going on at the moment as to whether you rip them down or you put them in a museum. But all of that becomes an opportunity for changing the discourse. And I agree entirely in the same way that Dr. Lopez was talking about what materials are we giving our leaders to read and where have those come from. In doing that, we should also obviously be saying to them, so what influence are you having in terms of the content that is being given to those whom you have responsibility for with regard to their learning within their schools? And it's that question then of, particularly in my context, of in the sort of context of working within a colonializing nation, how are we being activist as leaders? Where's our activism in what we're doing? And as was said just now, how are we in our preparation giving them the confidence to be able to challenge some of that hegemonic thinking that they're already part of or that they've been conditioned? And I think it's very important in that program not to blame anybody necessarily for their learned behavior, but to actually support them for relearning their way of looking at it, and that whole program of, if you like, behavioral modification in your leaders. So it has to start with self, and giving people the confidence to start with self and how they make sense of the world. So that's that criticality, number one. And for me, the second one is promoting a concept of non-solo leadership. Because I think once you start getting people to conceptualize their leadership and their principleship in a non-solo way, that starts to challenge notions of hierarchy, and starts to mean that people see that where they are working in a fragmented system, often as a consequence of neoliberal measures and approaches to competitiveness within schooling, that starts to get them to recognize that actually it's through collaboration and collectiveness that then you start to unpack the existing hierarchies and, as was said earlier, the inequities that exist but that we don't see, that are there. So those are my two approaches, the criticality and the non-solo leadership in how we continue to support principles in their preparation and their evolution, their continuing development.
Great. And now Mohammed.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? Perfect. Good. I would just like to build on what Ian just said, especially the component of reflexiveness and criticality, and maybe just pose a question. All of that just helps ground us. We're working for the student, and if we are working for this student, let's remind ourselves what kind of world are we preparing the student for. And again, if I look at students here in Morocco or students in the US or students in many countries that I've worked with, they yes, they do have their unique specificities, but they have a lot of things in common. And if you look at every single curriculum, you're going to see preparing students for the 21st century skills. I'm sure I can wager that you will find it in every national curriculum. Are we moving into a world where we're going to be more similar than different? And who decides that? And what's the part of our diversity in this? Where do we weave our diversity into a world where it just seems to me that we're actually the world is getting smaller and smaller, and we're bringing with us those memes and genes that should help this world be smaller, but at the same time smarter and more thriving and more equitable and taking care of all its people and inclusive, etc. So maybe I take a bit of a different spin on coloniality, and I ask myself the question of, okay, what is it when you decolonialize? What are you left with? as a leader, you got to ask those questions because you live in some kind of an ecosystem, and you're really bound by the Hippocratic motto of "do no harm." You just don't plant stuff in your students' minds that doesn't help them be critical, and at the same time be brutally critical, even of critical of things that maybe they just I don't know, feel good. So I keep on raising this question because it's very, very important for me. Again, I reminded myself of another thing that you are going to see in each country's curriculum. We want to make sure that we have a very competitive workforce. So, and these students, when they graduate, we wanted them to get high-paying jobs, because by getting high-paying jobs, they are going to be able to take care of their families and communities. For me, these are very important questions to ask, because it comes back to our ability to read the world. Reading the world here for me is very important. Like this coloniality, the kind of context that we've recently, not necessarily recently, because again, colonialism has always existed and countries have always expanded in one civilization next to the other. So I'm assuming maybe 50 or 60 years from now, we're going to have to deal maybe with others. But what do you, as a structure, as a unit, as a community, do to make sure that you continue to lead, you remain resilient, and you thrive, and you deal with this complexity, and you got the language to read it? For me, and if I were to speak to a leader of the 21st century, if you speak one language, you're kind of bound by the world in which you read. And if you want to decolonize your thinking, you really need to pick up another language. Because when you pick up another language, you start even questioning and challenging many of the things that you took for granted just because you were socialized linguistically into thinking about them one way or another. So for me, this multilingual way of interpreting, reading the world has an impact on how you prepare our students, and at the same time our future teacher workforce and school leaders, to deal with a diverse world where actually models of thinking compete, and some models of thinking seem to be more attractive than others, because with them, if you adopt them, you get jobs. Others you don't. So how do we make sure, for example, that those others that are left behind, especially here, I would emphasize the community aspect to it, the collective intelligence, where actually many of the colonized cultures do two things. Number one, build the critical mass together, especially in terms of research and community work, being like in developing these communities of practice and in the critical mass that have some kind of an impact at the practice and at the policy level. This is very, very important. And the second important piece as well is really making sure that you embrace this world where maybe what's non-dominant is actually your added value, and you package it in a way that makes you more appealing to the world that we're getting or preparing our students for. So for me, it's highly complex. It's not just about, okay, we don't like it, it's bad, let's get rid of it. But just remember, sometimes the enemy you know is better than the enemy you don't know. And when we develop these critical capabilities amongst our students to embrace the fact that the past is there to actually to inform the way we move forward and the way we move together, I think you're making the best use of coloniality is just part of a context that you work with.
Interesting.
If I may, the intervention made me think about perhaps a somewhat different approach to view this issue, and thinking that coloniality at the beginning was colonization was at the beginning just a territorial expansion, an imposition of by force of many of ways of seeing the world, thinking about the world, and doing things. When the territory, where that expansion, the colonies were left behind. Uh, People wanted to come back to whatever they were left with, although they were left with ways of thinking, but a lot of people started thinking about reclaiming their identity and who they are. And for example, I see a lot of the work with indigenous communities in Mexico and Central and South America, and even here in the U.S., Spain, for example, Spain, if you let people to decide sovereignty and autonomy, it will break down in 3-4 different places, reclaiming their own identities. And so indigenous communities are claiming for their autonomy and their sovereignty to decide, their identity and their language and how they want to run their schools and their governments. And so that is something we we have a hard time dealing with, because we say this so-called globalized world will break out in many different little pieces. And why? Because this globalization is also something that has been hegemonic, something that has been imposed by force or by different ways of thinking or a hegemonic way of thinking. So, and we find ourselves, allowing, for example, I follow and I work with a lot of people working with the Zapatistas in South Mexico. And I'll probably bring this up back later, but they have carved out a niche of autonomy and sovereignty and run their own schools in a different way from the Mexican government. And a lot of people are looking at what the indigenous communities in Chiapas and Oaxaca are doing, because that is a different way of running schools or doing things, educating children for the world, whatever that world is going to be. I don't think we know what the world is going to be next year because of the pandemic or because of the economic reasons or whatever. So the other thing we need to question is, what's that world what's that 21st century? Again, I go back to what a previous speaker. Do we want to go back to that normal, whatever that normal was? I doubt it. We won't. So what's the future? What's ahead? And I think we need to construct that somehow.
If I could just quickly just add one, since we're having a quick conversations around coloniality, that's something that I've not heard, and maybe. So, racism looks the same way, doesn't matter where you are on the face of this earth. Poverty looks the same way, doesn't matter where you are on the face of this earth. Homophobia looks the same way, doesn't matter where you are on this earth. Islamophobia looks the same way, doesn't matter where you are on this earth. Ableism, all of the ways in which marginalized people have been oppressed. It doesn't matter where you are. You might experience it differently given structures and context. I think we must also keep in mind that in ways in which sometimes neoliberalism makes us want to normalize these things and sort of be more focused on what be more focused on is almost it's like that person who is a principal in a school. You have two choices. Am I going to take the promotion and continue to marginalize students, or am I going to engage and find some agency to act on behalf of communities? And those are conversations that happens all the time. So maybe I think we maybe find a way to keep that, sort of ground that within the conversation. Just quickly, I just want to say that we haven't really talked about power and how coloniality in many ways sort of is that long-standing pattern of power that really defines, I think, what all of my colleagues have been saying. So it defines culture, it defines labor, it defines, relationships among peoples. It defines so many things. So I think, again, we find space within what all, sort of existing within this world, and find spaces not to let go of those deep-seated colonial ways of thinking and knowledge that perpetuates sort of, I think my colleague said, preparing students for the globalized world without even really unpacking what that means.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah. All of you have mentioned the need for change. And I guess I have a question about, like, how do we get there? I think we've been having this conversation around social justice for a long time, and things still remain the same. So how do we move our programs and our organizations forward in this space? You can just jump in. I won't call on.
Well,
I'll just quick.
personally, I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead. You could just go ahead. I honestly think it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And the beauty of a marathon is that you don't find 50 people. It's hundreds. It's a huge movement. And when you're talking about movement, then you're talking about education. And we talk about not just education and the power of organizing. You're talking about a huge focus on equity and critical thinking. These are very, very important. And critical thinking when it serves you and when it doesn't serve you. Not just the critical thinking you like, but the critical thinking you don't like. Because these are dispositions of the mind that we need to be well in, I think, to embrace fully if we are very serious about creating a coalition that just tackles issues of social justice in general. Because again, and I don't know, history has shown that without I would call it more of a rigorous commitment to critical thinking, and even I would call it even sometimes it's not the hard truths. It's easy for the oppressed at some moment in history to be an oppressor and to forget all the things they had to go through because there is no critical thinking. And again, I continue to believe that this 21st century that we're already in transition into the 22nd century, I heard something about this I would call this value type politics, where each single group yes, they want to identify or be at peace with who they are, get a sense of knowing thyself before you know the other. It's very important, it's very healthy, but there is a certain point where it becomes self-defeating from at least in my point of view, from a view of the world that should be focused on pluralism and diversity and multiple perspectives of seeing the world, and on the fact that this planet actually does have major common challenges that do not differentiate between America or Kenya or Morocco or Djibouti or whatever. When COVID hit us, it did not ask for our passports to decide which country is going to hit more than the other. But again, I always remember that if our collective trust, our collective brain trust was much more powerful than it is already, and if we were able to tap the full intelligence of the global south as well, we would not be waiting for this company or this lab to come and save us. Because and this is where we have to ask ourselves these hard questions right now, even at the global south. Yes, we want to be taken seriously. What are we doing to be taken seriously? This is for me a very critical question to pose as well.
Right.
The other thing that I think propels me to think about is that we work within the confines of institutions, universities, most of our time, although we do community work with community organizations. But we need to think about how the universities have been institutionalized by the context and the structures in which we live, and that's also an incremental work. How do we recuperate the public space where we can have the dialogues and the conversations that are hard to have anywhere else in the public space right now, because everybody's thinking about their own, and like somebody said, when people come to our programs, what boxes do I need to check to get my diploma, pass the exam, and get certified so I can apply for another job? And so how do we move the institutions, not away, but in a different direction, and to have create collectivities, people where they can really have different opinions, but be able to talk and face each other and see each other. I think that's the work that we people who work in the universities still need to do, and the incremental work. I mean, we lost a lot of ground, but that doesn't mean that we have lost the whole thing. I mean, that's something that came to mind.
If I could, I just want to. We're talking about change and something we need to think about. It's something I struggle with. I think we all wrestle with. So let's take today, for example, and let's look at what's happening in the U.S. If you're standing in front of a class, so they had this election, and of course, all the progressives got together and had a coalition, and they made their voice heard. So now there's another group who is saying no, but you need to come over to us and help us deal with our sense of loss. Now you need to be handing out. And the point I'm trying to raise here is, where are the voices of the marginalized within the discourse? And so I think when we talk about change, who is leading that change? Whose voices? Because that is a dialogue that's happening now, as to who needs to yield, and it's almost as if, the we're being asked all the time to hold performance for neoliberalism, hold the structure in place, hold your pain in place, hold the racism in place, hold all of these in place so that we can keep some larger entity intact. So I don't know, how would folks engage if they were standing in front of a class today, working with some of their school leaders around, or emerging school leaders around, engaging in this critical moment. What do you say, uh, what do you say to the students who've been waited so long to feel if they can breathe? Do we then just say, well, we got that? So I don't know, how do we, and that's something we all wrestle with, and that's, I don't know, maybe something we can talk about, because my feeling is that in leadership courses we spend a lot of time teaching our students how to be performative, how to talk a good game, how to check the boxes, how to, spend time disrupting what neoliberals call identity politics, and undervaluing, I think it's my colleague talking about the work, for example, in some indigenous communities where they are showing different ways of leadership. And how do we bring that kind of knowledge into this uni space that seems built on some structure of what always counts as knowledge, and given sort of a space. So I think there are some complexities maybe that we can think through a little bit more if we're going to have the change you asked. How do we move the change? And how do people experience that change? And I'll be, change in universities meant a line at the bottom of an ad that said, all people of color and ability and all kinds of descriptors apply. But yet when we walk into uni spaces and look around, who do we see?
Others have thoughts or comments on this?
I think if we're going to think about how we bring about change, which is your question, we need to, the privileged need to accept letting go of their privilege. And that sounds a bit like what we call in England, sort of, I don't know whether you have this expression in the United Kingdom, turkeys voting for Thanksgiving or turkeys voting for Christmas. How do we encourage people to let go of their vested interest, their advantage? They're on the right side of the iniquity. And I actually think one of the ways in which we can do that is to be quite critical about the power dynamics that exist in knowledge production. And I think that's quite telling for us as, if you like, leaders within our industry, for UCA and Bolmas and ERA, and to be thinking about how some of us enjoy a sort of privilege and a vested interest in the knowledge generation industry, and how we have a privileged position within the mobilization of knowledge. And very often those marginalized voices are more marginalized or kept marginalized because of what I would call the performativity tyranny. And we wrap that up in standards, and we wrap that up in rigor, and we wrap that up in perpetuating a discourse that has served us well, and all those elements of sustaining initiation to be more like me. So we maintain that sense of othering by calling it this, as was said, this performance agenda. And of course, a whole performativity that we are that we do, you're right, prepare our principals, because in many cases, that's how they keep their jobs. And the whole element of how well youngsters are performing and doing in tests, etc. So, of course, all of that is actually counter to diversity. So, and that was the normalizing zeal that, of course, is what many of us have been talking about so far. So I come back to, how do we encourage people to recognize the agency that they are bringing to perpetuating the present iniquities, particularly, I think, in the knowledge production, knowledge generation, knowledge mobilization that many of us are party to.
Mhm.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Ian was saying, I think, to me, change always starts with leadership. And, well, maybe it doesn't start with leadership, maybe it starts with sort of awareness, and then leadership accelerates it. And I find that, when you, if you just took the narrow field of education and you talked about leadership in it, there's so little investment in leadership in the education space, particularly in the global south, which is the area that I'm most familiar with. And if we're not investing in, and I guess maybe the question is that a deliberate thing where, you don't train your leaders, because if you train them, then they realize the agency that they have. And they have the agency to bring in local traditions. They have the agency to do all sorts of things. And so maybe if we don't train them, then they don't realize that agency. Because one of the things we find through our programs is that this sense of agency, or what we call shifting mindsets or whatever, like that's one of the biggest things that happens when school leaders come and actually get trained, and they realize, oh, like I can do this in my school. I can actually tell my teachers to plan a lesson. Like I don't have to just listen to them. Like see what the ministry said had to be delivered on this day in this lesson. And I think so I would actually just encourage some thinking around how can bodies like UCA, Belmas, others like that, how can they start pushing for greater leadership education outside of their immediate geographic regions. And I know Mohammed has been very involved with the ICSI conference, which was held in Morocco. And I think that was great. Suddenly, a conference that had never been held in the global south was in the global south, and it became truly international from that. But how do you use these venues to push for greater leadership in regions outside of the region on which you're specifically focused?
And Azad, if I may add, the shift should not be thought of as what's the word, a manifestation of self-denial or self-abnegation. No, it should be self-serving, because there is so much potential in terms of that shift, like, for example, for thought leaders, for knowledge producers, to challenge themselves to diversify the way they think and the models they use. Because by doing that, they remain viable. As you know, many of the models right now have reached really their bankruptcy stage. And are they ready to take on the next challenge? I've heard that there is another superpower right now that's taking over as an economic superpower. Like what kind of what's called knowledge production possibilities do we have? Like what kind of an approach to collaboration, cooperation? Imagine with me, between India and China, that's a gigantic proportion of the world population. If those two, but these two countries, sadly and unfortunately, with all the richness of their culture and contributions and philosophy, are not as influential in something, for example, as basic for us as the conversation we're having right now. And for me, that's an opportunity that needs to be seized. So certainly I agree with you. UCAA and others should consider really challenging themselves and stepping into uncomfortable zones, because that's the only way to learn. One other thing to keep in mind, because again, just the very fact that we're talking about leadership, and then thank you all for saying this, we're really underscoring the importance of agency, the importance of having a vision, the importance of pushing things forward, the importance of really critiquing and asking the tough questions. And this is at the individual level. Then even at the collective level, at the distributed level, this is where we need to be right now, where it's the sharing that Ian talked about. This is also an instance of sharing, where you're not just sharing knowledge, you're not just sharing privilege, but you're sharing the leadership dispositions. Because one of the hallmark of a leader is not just the actions or how grand they are, but how many leaders they prepare. And if we think that way, I think we're contributing to create this critical mass of individuals and collectives who are able to contribute to the betterment of their community and the betterment of the world at large. And we break with that dependence mentality that unfortunately many groups have, dominant and not so dominant, where it's always about the other, and there is little question about where we fit in terms of that locus of control. What's our responsibility in this? Because again, sometimes if we don't ask those questions, we buy in the victim's mindset, and we continue to what's the word, to perpetuate the assumption that we're incapable of taking care of ourselves in doing things differently and being positive contributors to the world. These are all tough questions we should be asking, and there is no better place than leadership, just given its huge potential to change things.
If I could just quickly just respond to that a little bit. I am wondering though, if we in positioning the global south as some kind of, we're not talking about history here. The countries of the continent of Africa were robbed from their resources. There's so much historical context that we sometimes in ed leadership overlook. Many folks on the continent of Africa believe that they're being recolonized by certain powers. There is no way we can have a conversation as a matter of around ed leadership, and doing that agency we're talking about without acknowledging ways in which many countries were robbed and find themselves where their knowledge was taken, their resources were taken, their histories were taken. And not only was it taken, it was denied from the text. It was denied from the knowledge production. So I think we have to be very careful in ways in which we inadvertently buy into the language that folks are feeling as if they're victim. We have to be very, very careful, because that almost does not acknowledge the historical context of oppression, the historical context. And as a Black person, when we go into spaces, you can sit around and folks have conversations around diversity without acknowledging anti-Black racism. And what does that look like and how it impacts us? So I think we're in a moment, I see it in a moment of possibilities where Indigenous knowledge is no longer on the fringes of ed leadership, but centered. Where the communities who are doing the work is centered. Where anti-Black racism, education, and knowledge is centered. That is what we're talking about. We're not talking about remaking neoliberalism. We're talking about reimagining a new future where marginalized voices become the center of the discourse and action.
Sounds
Great.
good.
Yeah. So I think given the time, we are supposed to be opening this up to questions for the audience. So we will do that now. And I know there's been a lot of action in the chat. around some of the comments that people have made. So we're
Can we see those, or how are we going to handle that, the comments?
Yeah, I'm trying to scroll to see if I can find this. Okay, so there's one question here I'm seeing that, and this is directly for Anne, I think, that the person says, I agree about your standing on reclaiming spaces and calling white supremacy what it is. However, what can minority students do in order to decolonize their own spaces?
So first of all, I see number one, the decolonization process begins with self. It is about decolonizing the mind. And having grown up in Jamaica, schooled in colonial knowledge, I also had to decolonize my mind. I had to begin to love my black self. I had to begin to love my kinky hair. I had to begin to love everything. Then I had to go learn about the homeland of my descendants. I'm a descendant of the enslaved. Knowledge was not given to me. What was given to me throughout my whole education was ripped away from my culture, was ripped away from my history. So the first thing I would say is really begin to understand your own grounding, your own history, and begin that decolonizing process of the mind. And the second piece, I think we also have to be mindful that we live and work in our context. But I truly believe that everyone should begin to find agency. There comes a time in our lives when we speak up, when we challenge, sometimes collectively, sometimes individually. Um, the whole world looked at that man, lost his life on the side of the road. It took the courage of one person to take a video and to make the decision to make that video public. So what I would say is also have critical friends, because this work is not only traumatizing, it's exhausting, it's tiring. And so it also know what's in your context, know what the risks are, know what you're able to bear, within your family. But I would say, ask yourself the question, which my grandmother asked me: what am I willing to give up for justice? What am I willing to give up to advance? What am I? So that's what I would say. So it's not an intellectual exercise. It's also a practical exercise as to how we choose to operate in spaces.
Great. One question that's been asked in the chat is, and this is for any of you who want to respond, how do you sustain yourself in this work? What brings you joy?
I'll probably take a stab.
Okay.
Work, I guess, the kind of work I do. I wake up in the morning and I don't believe this dystopian world, but I get a rage and encourage to continue working for social change, for uh, uh, visualize and undo structures of power, at whatever level. Um, I'm very much in favor of the environment, to conserve and keep it and clean it. So I get discouraged. Well, actually, that's something I wanted to mention earlier. I think we need to bring the environmental sustainability agenda to the preparation of leaders and center leader preparation, perhaps around that. So I do a lot of work around that, and that keeps me alive. And because if all world is not well and alive, none of us will. So, issues of violence and inequity, I live them every day, and that keeps me going. And the world we live in are accentuating those things instead of eliminating them. So, as long as they are there, I wake up every morning tired, discouraged sometimes, but willing to work at those issues.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think there's this to me, it's just a sense of possibility, right? I mean, if I just focus on the issue of ed leadership, you just think of how confined the space has been so far and how much space there is to explore and to redefine and to bring, and as these voices that Dr. Lopez was referring to come to the center, what does that mean for the field? And it's just, there's so much possibility, right? And of course, there's all the pain and all that one has to acknowledge. But there is the sense that if you just looked at the issue of leadership in the context of this conversation, there's so much work that has to be done. There's so many countries in which school, there's education leadership is just not even an afterthought or even a pre-thought, or I don't know what it is. But there's so much work to be done, and I think if we can engage critically, as I think Ian's been talking about a lot in terms of think like what is the purpose of education? I think Dr. Lopez was being somewhat optimistic in her thinking that, I mean, in my experience over the last few months, we started out talking about reimagining education, and now it's just like, when can the kids go back to school? But somewhere in there, there's this thread of like, what can education be, and should English education be the norm in many countries where English wouldn't be the first? I mean, there's so many issues as you unpack it, and just thinking about those possibilities gets me excited and going.
Right.
I dance. I put on some good old reggae music, and I dance, and I find joy in my culture, my people. And none of us do this work without a collective around us. So that's where you find joy. I'm not as good as balancing work and life yet. I guess it's a balance for all of us. But I do find joy in the work. And my grandkids, I'm a grandma, and so my grandkids say, you're working it. So there's joy in the work and knowing that. And so I'm going to put a challenge to everyone on this call and maybe others. What if, can we just play a what if game? Games bring joy too. What if we never put Michael Fullen and Leithwood and Hallinger and all of the folks? What if we ever created a course outline that never had any of those names? And none of the names that we know in ed leadership, just a what if. And then if we can't find resources, so the students would have to search for alternative resources, and if they can't find it, then we encourage them to research it and create it. How about that what if as a joyful action?
I'd sign up to that, Joy, and because I actually welcome the idea of valuing knowledge that's produced at the point of adoption. I think that's the real methodology for empowering people. So I heard you then saying we can bring joy to others by giving them a sense of their own agency in finding their own solutions. And I think that is quite joyful if you conceptualize that, and so that those that have a place, and there is a place very much for those who work in the academy, if they see that their role is very much facilitation of the primary purpose of that, is those who are at the moment not feeling that they are worthy to be contributing to the work of a better tomorrow, and that they are just subjects or consequences of those who think that they're leading to a better tomorrow. I think if we see our role very much as enabling them, then I see that we'll move to a situation of a more balanced and nuanced relationship between those of us who see that our responsibility is the production and dissemination of knowledge, to those that actually are being empowered to be producing it and finding it for themselves and the answers. So I see that as quite a joyful state for us to work towards.
Great. So I've got I'm checking on the chat here, and I've got, so do you agree with the following statement? Coloniality is a system within an oppressive structure, socially, emotionally, and politically. I'm thinking on this because one of the takeaways is that putting the brown and black epistemologies in the center of the philosophical education model instead of an elective or an alternative in order to decolonize.
In my opinion, of course, I agree absolutely 100%. Because again, it's part of the journey. If you don't take care of the socialized toxicity, you've been digesting or taking in since you were maybe in pre-kindergarten through maybe your college, then there is no chance that you're going to be free to think differently and free to take a stance. And certainly when Anne mentioned I learned how to love myself, it's deep. Because again, if education erodes your sense of worth, then it has destroyed you almost irredeemably, and that's criminal. So certainly, I think yes, it has to be put at this in the center of our new thinking about how to decolonize our minds and decolonize leadership.
I definitely agree with that statement. And I was thinking about the Zapatistas sort of theme, and they say we need to build a world where all the other worlds can fit. And so, which means, certainly all those epistemologies have to be at the center of, first, I guess, rescue what is left. And there's a lot left of those epistemologies, and put them at the center of the table and discuss about what they bring to the preparation of leaders, which is a lot.
Yeah.
I agree with that statement. I can't tell you how nice it is to walk into a space as a black person. I'm sure for brown persons and other persons now in 2020 and not having and feeling that what you have to say in that space matters.
So another comment or question that we have here is from someone who says, I come from Burma, a former British colony, and I'm trying to decolonize myself. I agree with the idea of the Indian scholar Ashish Nandi that decolonization is not finding the antithesis of the West. What do you think?
I couldn't resist the temptation of responding. That's beautiful. That's exactly my thesis statement. Why are you always going to be anti-something? You're reactive. Certainly, that's a model. Be aware of it. Be aware of what it did. Then move on. Because again, it's the only way to it's the only way to lead.
Yeah, I guess as leaders, we need to learn first and then teach on how to convince and not to defeat. If we're thinking always on defeating something, that's a lose-lose situation for everybody.
Usually, no, I was going to say, usually leaders throughout time have led by getting followership through othering. And so they've done it through divide. And that's where I agree with what's just been my colleagues on the panel, that recognizing what is and then deciding your disposition towards it. And that is how a greater awareness comes. One of the things that I just recommend a way of thinking about, it's been mentioned a few times about Indigenous leadership and Indigenous knowledge. And there's Mac McCartney has led me to think previously, he's been looking at the Indigenous populations of our country that the Romans actually killed off. So before the Romans, and they brought a leadership style, which he calls the children's circle. And it's the way in which the leaders sit around and they make a pledge. And the pledge is anything that goes from this Council of Chiefs, anything that we decide, anything that we act upon, the test in terms of how we lead is it the children must not be harmed. The children must not suffer. And that's that. And it's the broader definition of the children. It's all the new beginnings in our environment. And I think that's a powerful way of thinking about how you make sense of how you've learned to be. Where might you go back to then think about how you could be?
Related to that, we have a question that says, and I think this is a great one for us to start to wrap up on, what does this discussion suggest for how we frame our purpose, particularly in terms of what we want for students in their lives, as well as their children and grandchildren in the future? So very related to the comment you just made, Ian. Anybody on our purpose?
Was that an expectation that I would speak? I was just thinking I had just spoken, and so.
Oh, no, I wasn't thinking you had to speak necessarily. Others on the panel, in terms of what our purpose should be now.
I'm a grandma, so I think the question talks about our grandchildren. So I see it as a simple purpose. Once you begin on a journey of decolonizing your mind and engaging in certain work, I think one of the pieces that maybe, we talk about sort of, we had this conversation on anti this and anti that. I think those kinds of things is almost like an acknowledgement of the persistence of oppression. So it's not a job that we are going to finish in our lifetimes. I think it signals this ongoing of the work, but it's also work that's fluid and that changes. So I think the purpose, at least for myself, is really to find community, one, whether it's with my students or community that I've just found here, and really to begin to, in the ways we can, with our agency, to work at dislodging white supremacy, the knowledge, and all of what it represents, and resist and challenge inequities. We can't be social justice leaders if we don't acknowledge injustice, and to really keep in mind and center those for people whose voices and experiences have been at the margins of our educational experience for far too long.
I would just emphasize something. I think it's super important to me, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I'm excited about working in international development contexts. Is never lose sight of the fact that solution is in the hands of the community and the individuals that you're dealing with, and make sure you work with them to find that solution, and also not just build the capacity in the organizing needed to make sure that take it to the next level, and that they are able to just use this word liberally, to kind of sell that solution to the rest of the world, so that they got something to bring. I think it's very critical. For me, the definition of the failure of a school is that when a child or a student doesn't have any options, when, for example, his city, be it in the United States or in India or wherever, if he is only prepared to live in that neighborhood, to work in that specific city, to be relevant just in that specific context, I don't think we're serving this person well, and we're kind of building maybe the new generation of slaves. But if this student has options, when they have options, they have power. When they have power, they cannot be bullied. And it's critical for us who are really passionate about leadership and leadership development in education to make sure that nobody's put in a situation where they have so limited options that they can be easily bullied. Because again, it at times, and it's sad to use sometimes the jungle approach to organizational development, but at times predators don't really ask for excuses to be predators. And we want to make sure that education is about power, but it is power when it gives people freedom to choose. And if they don't have those freedoms, then we're not serving them well.
Great, thanks. So in the final 4 minutes, does anyone have a final word they want to say, a summary statement you want to give?
I just would like to thank UCA. I think, I've been involved in UCA for many, many years now, and we were limited. Ian mentioned Belmas and the collaborative work with UCA, and that was relegated to a pre-conference, a one-room deal, work about this work. I used to go to those meetings when Bruce Barnett invited me, and I still can go, but, um, but now it's on the main stage front of UCEA, and I think that speaks for the new leadership and for the kind of work we are talking about here that needs to be done, and I think that's great. I hope this kind of dialogue continues.
Yeah, I would just second that because when we first started exploring what this thing called UCA is, we were really surprised that given how international the university academic population is in the U.S., how little work there seemed to be being highlighted within this forum, and even just today learning about the work that's happening in southern Mexico, like that's super interesting, and I mean one looks forward to the day looks forward to the day when one has discussions around like, well, how does upper pistas talking about leadership in their schools, or how are concepts like Ubuntu or Harambe or things like that, how are these concepts emerging within this larger field, and how does that develop the global perspective as well? So kudos to Monica and her leadership team and all of you at UCA.
Great. Well, I would also like to thank you all, the panelists, for having this great, engaging conversation. If you have a chance, take a look at the chat. There's a lot of people responding to some of the statements that you said and taking the conversation further. I think it was very, very stimulating, and I do hope, as you do, that we'll continue this conversation in the future. So. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so very. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Great to meet everyone.
Bye.
Great to meet you
Thanks.
as well. Bye-bye.